So, what were the key aims and ideas behind Mrs. Thatcher and the 1979 Conservative Government from the start? So, this discussion will focus really on just that initial period in 1979, because obviously things do change during the 1980s, and we'll come to that in later podcasts. So, the first thing to note about Mrs. Thatcher is she is often regarded as what is called a conviction politician. And what we mean by that is somebody who perhaps acts out of principle rather than any sort of particular political policy or expediency. So what we mean by that is somebody who feels what's right and is very much about her own feelings and her own thoughts and her own opinions about things. And a lot of this comes from her upbringing. She was the daughter of a grocer, so her upbringing was one of small business, thrift, hard work, getting by, determination, and all of these of those bits of her character become part of her politics too. Her father was a Methodist preacher. So again, church, family, discipline, morals, all those things are vital ingredients of Mrs. Thatcher's personality and come out in her politics, of course, as well. During the 1970s, she became part of a group within the Conservative Party, which is often termed as the New Right. Now, the New Right is a political movement in conservatism around the world. You get the New Right in other countries such as America as well during this period. And the New Right is a bit of a backlash against the post-war consensus that had dominated world politics, Western politics, since 1945, particularly in the United Kingdom, of course. But there was a feeling amongst some in the Conservative Party, not just politicians, but writers, thinkers, journalists as well during the 1970s, that this consensus hadn't worked, that Britain had underperformed, we had all these economic and social problems, and part of that was due to the way we'd run the country since 1945, particularly the suffocating involvement of the state. Mrs. Thatcher and the New Right were very keen to roll that back. So some of the leading figures in this New Right movement within the Conservative Party was Mrs. Thatcher's mentor, Keith Joseph, who was a senior figure in the Conservative Party, had a reputation as being a thinker and an arguer for these more radical policies of conservatism. And Joseph was heavily influenced by economists such as Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman from the Chicago School of Economics, who did a lot of work on getting the state out of people's lives, for free markets, for liberalisation, for privatisation, and most importantly, I think, for targeting inflation as being the real evil in society. The thing that needs tackling before you tackle other economic measures. Action against excessive trade union power. All those things are part of this New Right manifesto that developed. And Mrs. Thatcher is very much the mouthpiece for that group eventually. She's thrust to the front. So it's important you see Mrs. Thatcher not as the inventor of these ideas, of these New Right ideas. They resonate with her character and her upbringing, and she becomes the spokesperson for this movement within the Conservative Party in the 1970s, this development of this New Right agenda. So if we look a little bit at this New Right agenda, we've talked before about some of the economic thinking behind it, and the idea of tackling inflation, tackling the unions, and freeing up business and people's lives and rolling back the state as holding back Britain during this period and destroying incentivization and entrepreneurial spirit, all those things. You'll notice that some of it is very similar to Ted Heath in 1970 in the Selsdon Man programme. And there are lots of similarities, of course. New right ideas are not new. You can see them in Heath's policies in the 1970 to 74 Conservative government. However, of course, Ted Heath famously U-turned against these radical policies at the end of 1971 in the face of public pressure, electoral pressure. And Mrs. Thatcher was very much of the viewpoint that he should have stuck to his principles and he should have continued with the programme. And that's the big difference there between Mrs. Thatcher and Heath, is that Mrs. Thatcher is willing to go through with this right till the end, and she's going to stick to her guns and stick to her principles. So part of this is a backlash. The new right and Mrs. Thatcher is a backlash against Heath and his willingness to compromise his beliefs, really. She's not going to do the same, quite famously. The lady is not for turning, as you'll see as we move on into the 1980s. But the other point I just want to make is that, all right, generally this is about economic change. The new rights agenda is about economic change, but it links in with society in so many ways. The new right and Mrs. Thatcher were both believers that the state had fostered a dependency culture, that people were not responsible for themselves anymore. They expected the government and the state to help them out if there was a problem. And in that there is a little bit of a laziness, which you can see in the trade union movement and Britain's underperformance economically. And this dependency culture needs tackling. It's also linked to the moral decline in Britain that you can see in the 1970s. You have the development of the permissive society in the 1960s, which of course was Mrs. Thatcher had no connection with whatsoever. And she felt that people had lost their responsibility and their willingness to help themselves. And all of these things are mixed in with the social agenda of new right politics at this time. And again, we're talking about the decline of Britain. You know, that Britain since 1945, through the welfare state, through Keynesian economics, through the permissive society and the reforms of the 1960s of the likes of Roy Jenkins, Britain is the sick man of Europe. Britain is in a terrible state in the 1970s. You can see this in the winter of discontent. You can see this in various social aspects, crime levels, respect for traditions, respect for the family, the decline of the church, law and order, etc., drug use, sexual freedom. All these things are connected and explain why Britain finds itself in such a state in the 1970s, arguably. And Mrs. Thatcher is determined, as Ted Heath was, but more determined to put Britain back on the map and to change things for good. And perhaps that is the big break in 1979. You're going to see a Conservative government that is ambitious to stick to its guns, determined to put its ideas into practice and not to back down. And in that lies the controversies of the 1980s, the resolute determination of Mrs. Thatcher to bring her solutions in for the good of the country. But of course there are going to be casualties, and some of these measures are going to be controversial and cause a lot of unrest, which we will come to in podcasts to come.